Thank you for plugging into this Family Life News podcast, streaming issues-driven, family-focused news.
This is Faith Under Fire. Each Thursday on Family Life, we give voice to religious battlegrounds in this nation. With us today, Randall Wenger, Chief Counsel with Independence Law Center in Harrisburg. A big win for religious freedom this week. Would you first tell us about the Supreme Court case centering in Pennsylvania involving Little Sisters?
Absolutely. A great result for religious liberty. For many years now, for-profit companies and religious groups like Little Sisters of the Poor have been battling because of a government mandate telling them that they need to provide drugs and devices that can result in abortion. So contraception and abortifacient contraception, a mandate that was put in place during the Obama administration. Finally, the Trump administration ended up changing those regulations, providing a broad exemption for groups on the basis of religious conscience and moral conscience to be able to say, no, we can't provide these drugs and devices and not being penalized by the government. Because as it was, if you didn't follow this particular mandate, you could be on the hook for a fine of $100 per employee per day, just crippling fines. $100 per employee per day.
Wow.
And the Trump administration gave some broad religious liberty protections. And then, unfortunately, Pennsylvania's Attorney General, Josh Shapiro, jumped in, filed a lawsuit, and actually got a nationwide injunction put in place that stopped this liberty-protecting exemption from the Trump administration. So Little Sisters of the Poor, who was in front of the Supreme Court back in 2016, found themselves back at the Supreme Court again this year, arguing that their religious conscience was in jeopardy by this lawsuit. And the Supreme Court was tasked with deciding whether the federal government had the ability to be able to carve out these religious protections for religious groups. And we got an outstanding opinion from the court stating that, yes, of course, the federal government needs to pay attention to the religious liberty of its citizens, and it certainly had the power to carve out these broad protections for religious conscience. So this is a big win for religious liberty. We hope that this is the last trip that Little Sisters of the Poor needs to make back to the Supreme Court, and believe that this precedent is going to be helpful in other areas for years to come as the court is recognizing the important duty that the federal government has to be looking at religious liberty when it's crafting regulations.
Yeah, absolutely. Would you tell us briefly about Little Sisters of the Poor? Because I think some people may not be familiar with them.
Yeah, it's actually a group of nuns that is involved in doing really tremendous work, particularly with the elderly. They're doing so much good for the world around them. They're taking a lot of the brunt that unfortunately ends up falling on government, but groups like Little Sisters of the Poor can do better work than the government can because they're bringing faith into their work as well. It's good news for Little Sisters and good news for the rest of us who benefit from the work that they do.
Yeah, and other organizations like them. Randy, I saw that Pennsylvania Attorney General Josh Shapiro has responded, and he says the fight is not over.
Yeah, so I'm hoping that this is the last trip to the Supreme Court, and hopefully the lower courts will get this one right along the way, because as I look at the majority opinion in Little Sisters of the Poor, it certainly explained that the federal government had not only the authority but the duty to do what it was doing.
I wonder if this is what Gorsuch meant after the LGBTQ discrimination ruling a few weeks ago. He said there are some religious protections coming down the pike. Because some of us were like, what? What's going to happen to churches and what's going to happen to Christian ministries?
And that relates very much to the second case, too, that you've brought me on to talk about, Our Lady of Guadalupe, which dealt specifically with religious liberty in the employment context, which was one of those question marks that was put in place by the Bostock decision a few weeks ago.
Do you have any details on the Our Lady of Guadalupe school case involving teachers?
Yes. That case involved two Catholic schools out in California. And the question there was how far the ministerial exception extends. But really, to put that all in layman's terms, it really had to do with how much leeway Christian schools have in their ability to be able to hire people who share their faith, not only in the nominal standpoint, but actually a commitment to the tenets of the faith, living a lifestyle of the faith. So the Supreme Court has previously carved out a number of times something called the ministerial exception. Its genesis was for ministers, for churches, where the Supreme Court said, look, we can't be applying employment law in the same way to churches and to their ministers, because if we tell them who they can hire and that sort of thing, it imperils their ability to really set the tone for their faith. But a few years ago, in a case called Hosanna Tabor, that was extended to a school teacher at a Lutheran school. And the court said, yeah, the ministerial exception applies there in that context. And today was another extension of the same concept in a school setting where the Supreme Court said, look, the ministerial exception applies not because somebody has a title minister or because they had training to be a minister, but because they're doing those kinds of religious functions that a religious organization counts on having somebody who really shares that faith commitment. So that, too, is a big win for religious liberty and the ability for schools.
It's nice to report on good news. Any takeaways for us going forward of how we can stay up on similar cases to this, or how we can be mindful in the fight for religious freedom?
Yeah, how to be mindful of your religious freedom. The cases where religious freedom are just legion. They're coming all the time because as government grows, it gets its hands in more things. And then as we find ourselves in a more and more secular society, we find that our religious convictions are more often running sideways with what at least some government agents may want. And the Supreme Court is clearing off its docket for this summer, but there's going to be some really interesting things coming down the road, particularly on the heels of Bostock. But one in particular deals with Catholic social services in Philadelphia. It's Fulton versus City of Philadelphia. That case will be argued this fall, and the question is...
foster care?
Yeah, and basically the City of Philadelphia kicked one of the oldest foster care providers, who was doing foster care even before government was doing foster care in the City of Philadelphia, doing really tremendous work. They're being kicked out essentially because of their views on what marriage is, trying to have fidelity to their religious commitments. So these issues are going to be coming up more and more as we're trying to figure out what role religion is allowed to play in a pluralistic society. And I remain hopeful that the Supreme Court can get that right and recognize that we need to carve out large religious liberty protections so that those of us who are following religious convictions aren't going to find ourselves as lawbreakers. And it's an issue that really should matter to all of us. And as I try to explain this in more secular settings, we can all kind of understand how important freedom of speech is. And we may not agree with somebody's speech, but we also know at the same time that if we don't defend their ability to speak, then our own ability to speak is being lost. So I try to explain to others that even more important than freedom of speech is our freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, because if government can force us to violate our most deeply held convictions, there's really no stopping tyranny. That's why it's the first liberty. That's why it is absolutely so important. And so as we continue to move along, no doubt we're going to continue to have some wins, we're going to have some losses, but it's incumbent upon us to be able to explain why religious liberty is important and help those around us to see that it's in everybody's best interest when we protect religious liberty.
That's Randall Wenger at Independence Law Center. I'm Tracy Lynn, Family Life News.